Okay, they wanted to go to Israel. But later on, it became an issue of economics. We want to get out of Russia because we don't think that our children have an economic future. And then that opened up, well, where are we going to go if we don't go to Israel? Because we're not Zionist. So that was a whole political thing. And that could be a whole class in and of itself also. The politics behind how that was established, the dropout rate, and so on and so forth. But Jennifer, if you want to start rolling, I'll start the class.
Yeah, I think most of our regulars are here, and then I'll let anybody else in who comes by.
Thank you. So we're going to talk about Jews of Russia since the end of communism today. And I want to try to tie the course together just a little bit, because we've talked about certain themes, and we're going to touch on all of them in today's class. You know, certain themes, for example, emigration. Emigration played a big role since 1881, when the Tsarist government opened up the possibility of Jews to emigrate from Tsarist Russia. Assimilation, because again, back in the days of Tsars, assimilation was a state policy, and it was assumed that Jews would assimilate into the greater Russian population, become Russians. Also, we've talked about the theme of how Russia handled its minorities, because the different nationalities, the minority nationalities in Russia, Russia was an empire. And so that was and continues to be an issue in Russia. Also, structural and state anti-Semitism. So let's try to tie some of it together and talk about what's life been like for the Jews of Russia since the end of communism. First, let's go over the populations. Between 1989 and 2002, some 1.5 million Jews and their relatives emigrated from the former Soviet Union. Of that figure, an estimated 62% went to Israel, and the remainder largely to the United States and to Germany. Now today, there are an estimated 156,000 Jews in Russia, around 105,000 in Ukraine, 12,000 in Belarus, and 8,000 in Latvia. So what is the status of the Russian Jews at the present time, since the end of communism? First of all, Jewish languages are no longer used. Basically, nobody speaks Yiddish, and very few speak Hebrew or can read Hebrew. Religious commitment is rare. Jews are acculturated to the majority cultures in Russia and the Ukraine. Jews now essentially do not live in rural areas, but in urban areas. They're a highly educated group. They see themselves as globalized, transnational Europeans, and are seen by the native populations as such. Neither national nor religious affiliation is compelling. Jewishness is part of their lives, but rarely dominates it. Now, for a minority of activists, being Jewish is nearly a full-time occupation. But for most, it is an identity to be evoked, even celebrated, but only on occasions. Well, with that country, especially with the Jews of Russia. And for the first time, Jews in Russia, there is no state-sponsored anti-Semitism and little to no structural anti-Semitism. Since 1989, in contrast to the communist era, there are intensive relations and exchanges with Israel, in fields of tourism, study, trade, Zionist youth activities, and cultural activities. Similarly, public Jewish organizations have been accepted into international Jewish bodies and are active in diaspora affairs. Now, one of the things that's very interesting is the strength of Chabad Lubavitch, in Russia. Chabad has established strong, if controversial, presence, even where they never existed before. Although most religious institutions are officially Orthodox, non-Orthodox alternatives have appeared, which are especially appealing to those who consider themselves Jewish, but are not so according to halacha. A wide range of Jewish organizations have developed, as have Jewish schools, journals, newspapers, social clubs, and welfare institutions. All in all, Jewish public life, visible and unimpeded for the most part, attracts a much larger and diverse constituency than it did under communism. So what are the main issues organized Jewish communities in Russia face these days? Well, one is the restoration of public and private Jewish property. That's still a major issue in Russia. Developing attractive and meaningful non-religious forms of Jewishness. Determining the criteria for inclusion in formal Jewish communities and organizations, and dealing with residual anti-Semitism. Now, what do I mean by criteria for inclusion in formal Jewish communities? Many Jews who were Jews by ethnicity, since religion had been outlawed for a couple of generations, starting as we learned in the 1920s, many ethnic Jews married non-Jews. Many Jewish males married non-Jewish women, which would make their kids, according to Jewish law, not Jewish, even though the kids might consider themselves Jews. And remember, we talked about some of the early refuseniks in the Zionist movement. We talked about, for example, Edward Dimshitz and Kuznetsov, the two guys who kidnapped, or who hatched the plot, kidnap a plane and fly to Sweden. Both of them would not be considered Jews by halacha because their fathers were Jewish, but their mothers were not. Now, in the past 25 years, much has changed for the better as a result of efforts by diaspora and Israeli Jews, and of course by the local Jews, to reconstruct Jewish communal life. But Jewish populations in Russia may be in terminal decline. And there's an open question right now as to what degree will younger generations commit to a public life in the former Soviet bloc. Especially as secular Jewishness dominates life in the former Soviet bloc, but its ability to command loyalty and survive across generations is questionable. Now, we ask the same questions here about American Jewry, but the questions are more critical in Russia because the options are less available. I want to read the text of a novel She's a modern Russian Jewish writer. When the came was the opening sentence to a lot of my grandmother's stories. These stories usually had a moral. When the Nazis came and we were on the train to Siberia, I saw a boy from our building went the story of the picky eater. Before the war, this boy had been a picky eater, but now hungry, and he was begging his mother Can I please have some bread? But this time, no one even had a crust to give him. As I struggled to finish my soup or kasha or cottage cheese, Grandma would reward my eating with more stories about the bombing of Kiev, about the 1 potato per day rations in Siberia, about the huge snowshoes an old man had lent her so she could walk to the factory in the winter because she'd been an idiot and brought only her fancy pumps. I'm tempted to deny that these stories had any psychological effect on me, because claiming that they had would seem like a cliche. My childhood in the late 1970s suburban Moscow had been aggressively uneventful. My entire built environment, from the concrete tower block where I lived to the plywood veneer furniture in our apartment, was roughly as new as I was, unconnected to history. My neighborhood didn't even exist in 1941, when my 24-year-old grandmother, a communications engineer classified as a valuable worker, was evacuated out of Kiev, saving herself, her mother, and her sister from certain death at Babi Yar. Her stories seemed like the stuff of television movies, not like something that actually happened to a woman who was force feeding me lunch at a spotless Formica table. Currently in Russia, there are 4 principal indigenous nationwide organizations. And I'm going to talk a little bit about them because this gives you an idea of how the Russian community operates these days. First of all, there's the Va'ad, which was formed in December 1989 as the umbrella organization of the new local Jewish communities. Then there was the Russian Jewish Congress that was set up in 1996. The Russian Jewish Congress was an attempt to unite, expand, and raise local funds for all types of Jewish activity. Then there was the Congress of Jewish Religious Communities and Organizations of Russia, Kirur, formed in 1993. It's one of the 2 major religious organizations that includes all non-Hasidic Orthodox communities. It's confederated with the Union of Religious Institutions of Contemporary Judaism So here you have a major religious Jewish organization in Russia in which Reform and Orthodox Jews work together. Now remember, we really don't have such an organization like that here in the United States. And that is an organization that's separate from the Chabad organization. Then you have the Federation of Jewish Communities, which was created in November 1999 by Chabad as a competitor to these last 2 organizations which I talked about. By 1999, some 70 universities in the former Soviet Union had programs of Jewish studies with a total enrollment of 2,500 students. By 2001, this had grown to 95 universities, with 5 in Moscow alone. The Center for Jewish Studies, which recently opened in the Moscow State University's prestigious Institute in Africa, in addition to St. Petersburg, with full academic programs. Professor Zvi Gittleman, a veteran observer of this modern Jewish community's development, notes that both factual knowledge and religious belief are conspicuously absent in the identity of most Russian Jews. Let me repeat this because this is important. Both factual knowledge and religious belief are conspicuously absent in the identity of most Russian Jews. So what is their Jewish identity based on? Primarily on feeling proud of one's nationality and to defend Jewish honor and dignity. These values far outweigh Sabbath observance, the marking of holidays, or the avoidance of intermarriage. Similar results were obtained and seconded by Rosalia Rivinkina, a sociologist affiliated with Moscow's All-Russian Center for the Study of Public Opinion. She did a study of Russian Jews, and she found out in her sample population that was chosen on the basis of Jewish surnames that the Jews that she surveyed overwhelmingly identified themselves as Jews, but knew little about Judaism, felt distant from traditional Jewish culture, and identified much more with the Russian culture that they felt part of. So on one hand, it's not hard to understand this situation when one considers the background of religious and cultural deprivation of the Jews of Russia, together with the high rate of intermarriage that has existed for close to 3 generations. Eugene Satanovsky, the president of the Russian Jewish Congress, defined Russian Jews, and I think this is interesting, as the first post-assimilationist Jewish community, formed by Jews who identify their Jewishness first and foremost as a nationality and not as a religion. By a show of hands, if I were to ask the people in this room, in our virtual class, how do you first and foremost identify your Jewishness? Is it as a religion or a nationality? How many would say as a religion first and foremost? How many would say as a nationality first and foremost? Yeah, interesting, huh? It is within this context of secular nationalism that Chabad is mounting its campaign of religious revival, working at multiple levels, including ritual observance synagogue, historical religious tradition, the community center of holidays, celebration of holidays, education of children and youth through a chain of kindergartens, day schools, summer camps, and ultimately, yeshivot. Chabad feels that the road to a strong and rich, positive Jewish identity will be a long one, but at least the road is now open, and there are available sources for learning. Now, in the same study, 62% of the Russian Jews who she interviewed were in favor of Jews remaining in Russia and maintaining their national, cultural, and linguistic identity. 23% advocated emigration to Israel, and 15% were in favor of assimilation into Russian society. It also tells you a lot about this post-assimilationist Russian Jewish community. Within the limits posed by the Jewish community's demography, which resembles very much the patterns particularly in cities. Now, this nucleus has grown in its relative weight in the community. So what is the view of the future, at least among community leaders and experts at the present time? One view embraces a Jewish ethnic cultural identity, not as a factor separating Jews from their environment, but as a contribution to a universalist human identity within a multinational society. And this is the official view of the Russian Jewish Congress, an important achievement. They've made the religious sector of the Russian community a full partner in consulting and cooperating with any community activities. The second important innovation was that the Congress brought local Jewish communities to engage in local fundraising to cover part of their own needs rather than relying exclusively on outside funding. Because it's very interesting, in the first decade between 1989 and the year 2000, most of the fundraising that was done for Jewish institutions, programs, activities, etc., all came from outside the former Soviet Union. Now is funds raised within the former Soviet Union. Chabad has built up a network of schools and centers in 48 cities in Russia. And that includes a seven-story community center besides one of their synagogues in Moscow. The Chabad activists see the Russian Jewish Congress and its allies not only as ideological rivals whose doctrine of Judaism is repugnant to them, but also rivals for the control of budgets, synagogues, and other community facilities that give prestige and power to the community, to those who control them. Basically, what that says, and what I'm saying, is that the power of Chabad in the former Soviet Union is much stronger than the power of Chabad here in the United States, politically, socially, religiously, and in the matter of fun, and in particular, in the matter of access to leadership, political leadership in the Soviet Union. Now, this is not the first time in the history of Russian Jewish community that Chabad has clashed with the religious establishment over the primacy of influence of the community. One of the reasons for Chabad's success in Russia, and one of the major reasons, is that many of the core Chabad community leaders and rabbis are not the children of foreign-born Hasids, but ex-Soviets who became Balei Tshuva, returnees to Judaism. Now, these Balei Tshuva these were Russians or Ukrainians who made a conscious choice not to emigrate. And also, this makes a big difference in the way they relate to Russia, its people, and its culture. Now, despite support from and for right-wing elements and a deep-seated national history of anti-Semitism, the policies of the Russian government under Vladimir Putin have been remarkably devoid of anti-Semitism. Appeals to nationalist, imperialist, and Eurasianist ideology, pragmatic politics, and foreign policy concerns fail to explain these policies adequately. Some people look to Putin himself in general, influential, positive relationships with us. They provide the personal influence of Vladimir Putin on Jewish policy suggests a personalized, centralized regime generally towards the Jews. So the question open for discussion before we wind up is, and we'll unmic everybody in a second, are Jews part and parcel of the Russian nation? Their story a triumph of a model Russian minority, including the most educated and most overrepresented among the highest prestige professions? Or is it a community of attrition and assimilation? Now, I want to remind you that the current number of Jews in the Russian Federation, or in Russia, is now estimated to be 156,000. Only 156,000. In the Ukraine, 105,000. In Belarus, 12,000. In Latvia, 8,000. And the other former Soviet republics, less than that, about 1,000 to 1,500. Of course, these are only estimates. So we're going to unmic you guys in a second. So are the Jews a triumphal story of a modern model Russian minority? Or is it a story essentially of attrition and assimilation and lack of a future in the Soviet Union? What do you folks think now that you've taken this class?
Well, I believe that there is a great deal of assimilation in Russia. All countries who have a great number of Jews, including the United States, Jews assimilate, maybe not to the degree that they do in Russia or did in Russia, but they are more assimilated from personal experience of friends. It's difficult at this point to understand what Putin, if any special reason for treatment of the Jews was less anti-Semitism or so I think that's part of the reason. But Chabad's success is really the numbers that kind of go towards this kind of religion, this kind of very, very Orthodox religion. That's kind of unusual, I think, because even if you look at numbers of Jews in the United States who are assimilated with Chabad Lubavitch, they're small. There are no other outlets for them other than the Chabad. So that's my view.
Before we get to the next comment, there is a view among some here in the United States that the future of the Jewish community is with the Orthodox, not just Chabad, but the Orthodox community. That the conservative Jews, secular Jews, and Reform Jews within a generation or two are going to die away, and only the Orthodox will be left in the United States. Now, I'm no prophet, and I'm not tied to any particular view, but that certainly is what's argued by some people who look at the future of the Jewish community here in the United States.
With regard to whether there's a thriving community in Russia or assimilated, my guess is it's assimilated, and for the most part, they must be older Jews that through inertia or otherwise have decided to stay. That would be my guess. I don't know what the demographics is.
Yeah, demographics tend to support that.
Well, I've always been of the opinion just because someone is born into Chabad doesn't mean they'll stay with it. My great-grandfather was an Orthodox rabbi in Galveston and here in Houston. And my parents, with a lot of people at Congregation Beth Jacob before it was UOS, left to go to Beth Yeshurun because they had the money to hire better Hebrew teachers and they had better bar mitzvah training. and also the women who were active in Hadassah, more of their friends went to Beth Yeshurun. So there was a movement, because when you look at Josh Furman has that blanket from the original Beth Jacob with all the men who were serving in World War II, and half of those families go to Beth Yeshurun. I never knew they went to Beth Jacob originally. Their parents went to Beth Jacob. Their parents were Orthodox. So, you know, I've always felt like they're religious Jews now. Their children and grandchildren will modify their religion, assimilate a little, and keep the ball rolling. They won't stay with this extreme, you know, kind of religiosity. It won't remain that way. There's no way.
It is interesting. You know, demographics don't make something real in the future, and demographics cannot prophesize what's going to happen in the future. Of course, none of us can. But if you look at demographic rates of intermarriage, demographic rates of reproduction, just those two alone, that both in the United States and in Russia, the demographics of intermarriage and the demographics of reproduction and continuity and the future of a Jewish community are very much with the Orthodox communities there and here, both. And that's why there are some people who claim that in the future, at least here in the United States, the majority, within 2 generations, the majority of the Jewish community here will be Orthodox of some form or fashion. And that's a question is, are the Jews of Russia one step or one generation ahead of us in those trends? There are some who argue that that's the case. And that's why that's an interesting example. But that doesn't mean that that's going to end up being the case in the future. And after Putin, who knows what's going to happen in Russia?
Yeah, that's true. That's absolutely.
Any other comments or questions about what we've covered in this class?
Well, I read a book about how all these Jewish engineers and chemists and everything, when the USSR fell apart, suddenly they could leave academia and become titans of capitalism. Like that one guy, you know, they went off and bought oil companies and aluminum companies and tin, you know, everything you can imagine. And they kind of were instrumental in getting Yeltsin into office. But when Yeltsin started to get very sick, they were upset because they needed someone else who would be nice to them and keep up the good work with the, you know, and so they found Putin, who was like a low-level KGB guy in some remote town outside of Moscow. And they're the ones that put him in office. And then about a year and a half, 2 years later, he started with nationalizing all these industries and taking them away from the Jews. But I mean, it's funny, but they're the ones that put him in office.
Yeah, Paul had said about that before also. But here's the thing, to even despite the fact that the Jewish oligarchs played an outsized role, most of the people in the community are not oligarchs. Most of the people in the Russian Jewish community are not rich. And the thing is that for the first group of professionals who emigrated from the Soviet Union, these are Jewish professionals who were scientists and other professionals who went to either Israel or the United States, many of them, even though they were professionals in Russia or the former Soviet Union, had a very hard time working in their professions in either Israel or the United States. Sometimes it was a language issue, but oftentimes it was a training issue, an education issue. The professional achievements that they had attained in the Soviet Union did not come up to the standards of the West in the United States, Israel, or Europe. Now that I think has changed in the last decade, but that's also a factor to consider too. Any last criticisms, comments? Folks, thank you for showing up week after week to this class. It's been a pleasure to be with you. I've enjoyed it. I want to give a shout out to Jennifer, who has made this possible. And thank you all for sharing the experience with us. Be well, and hopefully we'll see you soon in person.
Thank you very much. Enjoyed it tremendously.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye, Jennifer. See you later.
Bye. We'll see you all soon.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all.
Bye.